the logistics and coordination of these meetings. So you will see them and perhaps you can copy it on emails as well. As you just heard, this meeting is being recorded, so please keep that in mind. These mics are going to our remote participants. Please speak up when speaking so they can hear you. And then we do have a FOIA officer, FOIA coordinator officer for this subcommittee. It is Michael Fletcher. Any requests for public information requests should be directed to him. He's also CCPCR on those emails.
Thank you. Thank you. Before we get started with new business, are there any motions from any of the members? Seeing none, we will get started with the presentation on subcommittee roles and objectives.
So we're going to go through a few items today, just reminders of where we're at in this planning process, what we're trying to achieve. Master plan phase 2 from DCR side. So as you can see on the screen, the cluster planning master plan phase 2 is an update to our phase 1 plan. So we'll be talking about it in those terms. There's specified in code specific things that we must include in this update, which is what we are working to fulfill. Specifically updating the flood hazard exposure data, updating our flood impact assessment, and updating our project inventory, information about projects and initiatives that are underway or planned for the region. Also, just as a reference point, I included the phase 1 plan objectives on the screen. And the role of the TAC is to be an advisor to DCR in the development and implementation of this plan. So this is an overview of what we are working to achieve with this phase 2 plan. So you can see here those elements of code outlined. We do intend to create an updated flood hazard exposure model, updated flood hazard risk assessment, those planned resilience actions, which are the projects and initiatives. In addition to that, we're working on a financial need for flood resilience, as well as requesting that we work with each subcommittee to develop recommendations from the subcommittee for future planning. So we'll talk more about that in a couple of minutes. Importantly for this subcommittee, we are conducting outreach engagement throughout this process to collect feedback on the content and develop the plan. In terms of the projects themselves, in terms of the actual deliverables of this, we are expecting to produce two things. Firstly, an update to our existing coastal resilience web explorer, as well as PDF doc. This is our timeline that we anticipate. You can see at the top we have the quarterly meetings of the subcommittees as well as the full TAC. And then we, beneath that, have listed the different components that I just walked through and the subcommittees that we expect to be most engaged in supporting those elements of the plan as they are developed. Just to highlight, we expect stakeholder outreach and engagement to be ongoing throughout this process. And so we're looking for your ongoing support with developing that strategy for what we're doing in terms of outreach and engagement, and then also planning ahead for the future and reaching out to different stakeholders. So these are the draft subcommittee objectives. What we'd like to do today is get your feedback on these objectives, if these are the right things for the subcommittee to be supporting, if we should make any adjustments to what you all are here to do. For the first two objectives, this is specific to what we're accomplishing in this plan. So the contents of this document, this process. Firstly, to inform and support outreach engagement, as I just discussed for phase 2. Some specific ideas for what that looks like. Identifying and prioritizing what stakeholders we should be engaging. Advising on the goals and strategies for stakeholder engagement to be consistent with DCR's overarching community outreach and engagement plan, which I'll talk about more in just a couple minutes. And then guiding the implementation of those engagement strategies. The second objective is to help us strengthen relationships with key stakeholders. Many of you are representatives of those key stakeholders, and we appreciate your participation. So examples of that include, but are not limited to, working with minority communities, tribal nations, DRPs, etc. Lastly, for recommendations for future planning, again, we're hoping to have this process of discussing what those recommendations look like together with this subcommittee. But some initial ideas for consideration include identifying how we can make outreach and engagement sustainable for this plan into the future, and developing local capacity and needs assessment approaches. In terms of the schedule for this subcommittee, we have 6 total meetings between today's meeting and when we are required to produce a plan in December of 2024. This is an outline of what those meetings look like, what we think we should cover in each of those meetings between now and then. So today we're going to be talking about our draft version, DCR's draft version of our engagement strategy, and getting it back there. We will bring that back at next meeting to talk about it again. We'll also be talking about stakeholder identification at this meeting today, and then we'll come back with a stakeholder gaps analysis for our next meeting. You can see that for the future meetings, particularly looking out to 2024, we'll be getting ongoing feedback on our implementation of that outreach and engagement strategy, as well as working on recommendations for future plans. So at this time, I would like to pause and open it to subcommittee for discussion, particularly any feedback or proposed alterations to what I've presented in terms of the subcommittee's objectives and schedule.
Are there any questions or items for discussion at this time on the floor? Do we have any questions from online?
I'm going to. They're still having problems hearing.
Okay.
This will clear up a lot of that.
Yeah. Then I can stand behind the podium. Yes. See what I can do here. Yeah.
Brett, you have a question?
You have the floor. Go ahead.
If you put the question in the chat, I'll read it out loud.
But if you can put your question in the chat, we will read it out loud. Okay, I'm unmuted right now. I'm good. You can hear me. Okay, great. Brett, if you have your question ready at any point, please put it in the chat and we will read it to the group. I see something just came in the chat. Is that him?
We can hear Carolyn as well. Thank you for resolving the issue.
Wonderful. I'm glad you can hear me. Okay. All right, we will move on. Okay, so in this section, I'm going to cover 3 things. Firstly, the community outreach and engagement plan that I mentioned, the phase 1 completed efforts. So just a review of what outreach and engagement was completed during phase 1 of this plan, and then our draft strategy for phase 2. So in terms of the community outreach and engagement plan, some of you will know that this document is required by code to provide kind of a framework for how DCR is updating both our Coastal Resilience Master Plan as well as our Virginia Flood Protection Master Plan in terms of achieving meaningful engagement from the public. We released a draft of this plan in December of 2022 for public comment and received some responses to that public comment, which we've reviewed and are working on revisions. We have a draft document circulating internally at DCR right now to respond to those comments. Importantly, This document is intended to be a framework for outreach and engagement. It is not intended to be a strategy or a work plan for a specific plan development. It needs to be able to apply to multiple planning efforts and the variety of stakeholders that would be relevant for those different efforts. One major proposed update that we're working on is to incorporate goals and expected outcomes into the framework document. You can see those on the screen here. Goals 2 through 4 come pretty directly from the code language around this framework document and speak to seeking out participation, providing access to information and opportunity for participation, and using the feedback that we receive, incorporating it into decisions that are made during planning. Goal 1 came from feedback that we heard from the public comment that there was an opportunity to better coordinate with ongoing flood resilience planning efforts that are happening at other levels of governance, in particular with localities and PDCs, and coordinating and collaborating with those efforts in our work. Related to that point, this second update works on defining the different levels of planning that exist for flood resilience and acknowledging that different stakeholders are going to be most relevant for those different planning efforts. So we are focused on stakeholders of relevance to our level of planning with the Coastal Resilience Master Plan, which is that kind of second from the top lower gray box. Both the top gray box and the second gray box below it are DCR-led efforts for planning. The top is the Virginia Flood Protection Master Plan, which is proposed to be our statewide plan that will be produced by December of 2025 and will focus on state agencies and state policy action. The regional master plans looking ahead to the future are that regional level looking at more place-based strategies for projects and approaches at that level. We recognize, as I mentioned, that there are also planning processes happening at the regional and local levels. Each of these planning processes should have their own respective outreach and engagement efforts to reach the stakeholders that are most relevant to their planning, their level of planning and the types of plans that they're developing. We want to avoid creating confusion or redundancy with local plans. And we also want to embrace the whole community approach that we have adopted from FEMA. This is the idea that when we talk about community, we're talking about the whole community of stakeholders, including the private sector, including different state agencies, including nonprofit organizations, all of the entities that are relevant for creating a resilient Virginia that is not just limited to the state or to a level of governance itself. The third major update that we've included in our draft update of the Community Outreach Engagement Plan is to outline a process for getting to specific strategies for conducting outreach and engagement for these plans. So as I mentioned, this framework does not include specificity around we're going to do X activity on X month for this plan. So what we are doing is outlining this process, firstly, identifying constraints, secondly, conducting a stakeholder analysis, thirdly, defining engagement goals and methods, and lastly, aligning decisions and schedules with the methods in order to develop that specific strategy for each plan. And I'll come back to this outline later. Finally, although there are no specific methods proposed for the current plans in this framework document, we have outlined these considerations as guidance in developing the strategy, mostly focused on relationship building, recognizing that relationship building doesn't always occur on the timeline of a plan, and some of that is going to need to occur outside of the planning process. Recognizing that we need to learn from our stakeholders about how to best interact with them and what methods are going to be most effective for their various audiences, and some other ideas here. I won't read through them all. Are there any comments, questions on the Community Outreach and Engagement Plan framework before I move on to a review of phase 1?
So confirming this is a draft?
Yes.
Okay, so this has not been used on any project yet?
Correct.
Okay.
Yes. Yep.
Document titled Outreach Coordination Subcommittee of Coastal as 3 outreach and coordination objectives. Objective 2, we have some reference to prioritizing and engaging all critical infrastructure sector facilities and any
So I can go back to. The proposal was to include here under 2, correct, that prioritizing critical infrastructure owners,
critical infrastructure
sector
sector facilities.
facilities.
Is there discussion on this item? From the floor? And point of protocol, do we need to vote on these as they come up, or are they just?
No, we can vote if it's useful for advancing a decision and getting consensus, but it is not necessary to vote.
Can you restate what that was?
So do you want to read the suggestion again, Wheeler?
So it says the document titled Outreach and Coordination Subcommittee Coastal Resilience Act has 3 outreach and coordination objectives. In objective 2, we add some reference to prioritizing and engaging all critical infrastructure sector facilities. And then go to the link. So American Cyber Defense Agency, Cyber Security Infrastructure Security Agency has those critical infrastructure sector. We will include the link in minutes.
Great. From staff perspective, I will just add that looking at critical infrastructure is something that we are proposing to do alongside VDEM and to include in the flood hazard assessment piece of this. So that specifically, the VDEM is standing up a new or a revamped critical infrastructure working group that will include critical facility owners and also state agencies who are in the position of regulating those critical facilities or otherwise responsible for them. So we will be coordinating with those entities in that format. Our plan is to work with VDEM on that. So we can, certainly that is something that's being considered, and we can add that if it is of interest to the subcommittee.
Any more points of discussion?
On the flood resilience plan integration on slide 15, would it be possible to add somewhere in there where exactly tribal hazard mitigation plans fit into that scheme, whether it be more along with the regional ones or treated as a locality? I only bring it up just because tribal service areas kind of go across multiple localities, so they don't necessarily fit in that one versus like a more regional, like a PDC.
Yes, definitely open to feedback on that, where it would fit best on this, and I think we can certainly add it. Wonderful.
Any more points of discussion?
I apologize if this is an ignorant point. But is this the search for stakeholders and those to engage with, is this going to formulate another work group, or is this who we're pushing the updates out to? What is going to be the role of these stakeholders? I think that might also help, like, some background as to what their role will be.
Yes, and we'll talk more about that in the slides to come. I think that'll be a little bit clearer. We're doing it. This TAC has already been established by code. Membership has been established. We are asking all of the subcommittees to consider if additional advisors to the TAC would be useful. So part of it, the stakeholder identification could inform ideas on if you could you benefit from additional advisors on your topic, as well as not just advisors, but also having folks come and present or speak to the subcommittee or speak to their interests. So that is something, this is the last subcommittee to meet this quarter. That is something that has come up with the other groups. Beyond that, we are also looking for not just this format for engagement, but also beyond that, who we're meeting with for this planning effort, hosting public meetings, information pushes. So more of the just, educating folks about the fact that this plan is happening. So it will inform the outreach and engagement in a variety of ways. I think ideally, this would be the first step in the process of developing a plan. One of the first steps is identifying your stakeholders and then building the process for outreach around it. So looking ahead to future plans, we're thinking about it in that way.
Mary Carson, I'd just go back to the executive slide. She has a question, and we're hoping that maybe a question, but Mary Carson.
Mary Carson, do you want to go ahead and unmute yourself?
Can y'all hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. So for in number 1, the advise on goals and strategies for stakeholder engagement consistent with DCR's COEP. Does that include, somewhat related to, I think, the earlier comment, but it was kind of hard to hear. Does that include figuring out what it is we actually want stakeholders to provide feedback about? Or does that include how we want stakeholder engagement to look and to feel? Because I think it's really important to define what it is we want to hear from people and how those people will be heard and how their voices will change and impact the process. So I guess those two things.
So from staff response, the vision is that yes, it would include both of those things, both why we're engaging people, what questions we're asking them to help us answer, and how it feels, those more of how we're meeting people and reaching people. So just, I've lost the ability to advance slides. If you look at slide 16, that includes that slide that has the 4 different buckets of kind of the process for getting to the strategy. Has that second kind of block is for, well, the first block, the second block is who, the third block is how, and then the last block is really to getting to your point, the why, like why are we asking them questions? How are they influencing the planning decisions that are made?
Okay, that's super. I appreciate it. And I'm sorry, I don't think I have an online copy of the slide. So didn't want to ask a question that was going to be answered. My apologies.
No problem. And yes, we should think about that for future meetings. So yeah, this slide, I hope you can see it now with the final block on the align methods, decisions, and schedules, identifying those touch points for engagement to meaningfully impact planning decisions.
Thank you, Carolyn.
Any more questions at this time?
Okay. So we're going to discuss a review of what was completed during phase 1 of the plan. So on this slide, what I have done here is in the top row included the IAP2, the International Association for Public Participation, their spectrum of public participation, the goals that are included there. So from left to right, inform to collaborate, these different levels of public participation are basically least collaborative to most collaborative in their approach and their goals. So beneath that, you can see the different methods and audiences that were employed for the phase 1 plan. This is a summary, so not all the details are here, but I hope this gives a good overview for those of you who were not engaged in phase 1. In the inform side of things, we did a lot of information pushing through things like conference presentations, our website, outreach toolkit development, social media posts, etc. Under consult, we hosted public meetings. We hosted one in each of the planning district commissions, as well as published a couple of surveys. One, the centralized survey, was more of the practitioner-focused survey, and then we also had a public survey which was just geared to members of public residents of the coastal region. And then we also had a public comment period. For Involve, we had a workshop for practitioners. We hosted one of those in each of planning district commissions. We also hosted a federal partners and stakeholders meeting, which is a workshop style. And then finally, in terms of collaborate, again, this coastal resilience TAC existed under the previous development of the previous plan, and so we were collaborating with this technical advisory committee on an ongoing basis for the development of the plan. I skipped over, but it's important, I skipped over hybrid under-resourced community meetings under methods all the way on the left under inform. We did host 12 of those in under-resourced communities in the coastal region and had fairly good participation there. The note at the bottom of the slide is just to highlight that there is additional information on both the methods that were used and the results of these methods included in appendices J through M of the Coastal Resilience Master Plan Phase 1. For reference, this is the breakdown or the makeup of the Technical Advisory Committee under Phase 1, as well as the participation in the Community Outreach Subcommittee under Phase 1. So you can see that we've had a lot of members change in the subcommittee. Most of you are new to this group. You may have been engaged in different ways in Phase 1. So just as a point of reference. So we, on this slide, we're just showing some numbers, what we saw in terms of turnout and engagement from the methods used in Phase 1. Some were more successful than others, and I think we do have a lot of lessons learned from Phase 1. This was the first time that we were doing this Coastal Resilience Master Plan, so one of the objectives of this plan was to start building kind of a basis for ongoing outreach and engagement. Just a couple of examples. So the public meetings hosted had relatively low participation, but we then hosted the under-resourced community meetings, which had better participation. The latter was more of just information sharing than feedback gathering. In general, most of these efforts focus on kind of getting a sense of perceived risk and opportunity, and less on opportunities to provide direct feedback on the contents of the plan. So this is an example of some of the findings that came out of one of the methods that we used, the Phase 1 public survey. Again, you can see Appendix M for more information. We have breakdowns of some of the demographics of who participated, such as age and racial identification. And we have some good points of how people are experiencing flooding, how they think about flooding, and how they think about the role of both the state and their localities in addressing it. We also collected recommendations, or the different TAC subcommittees developed recommendations during Phase 1, and these are the recommendations from the outreach subcommittee. A few highlights that, firstly, further integrating the data collection efforts with the outreach meetings would have been helpful. Being specific about the goals of the meetings. Identify gaps in terms of which communities have been reached and which have not, and work with community-based organizations to fill them. And then use more marketing like press, media, and social media to spread the word about what's being done through this plan. Finally, the application of input to the plan. So feedback was applied, the feedback that we heard from these different methods was applied in a variety of ways. Firstly, again, the TAC was providing ongoing guidance, and that was pretty directly received by DCR staff and integrated into the planning process. Process and high-level findings were summarized in the plan, as well as the detailed processes and notes were summarized in the appendices. And then select findings have informed gaps to address in Phase 2. Just a couple of examples here. Rainfall-driven flooding challenges were noted by many communities as something that was important to address, but was not considered under Phase 1. We are working through that in Phase 2. And then increasing collaboration with local governments is something that we heard in a variety of formats and are working to address in Phase 2 as well. So at this point, I will pause and open for subcommittee questions on Phase 1 or any discussion.
Any questions at this time?
Okay. Okay, So this section of the presentation, my last section of my presentation, is to present a draft outreach and engagement strategy for phase 2, and then we'll discuss feedback on that. So applying that process that we viewed on the previous slide from the community outreach engagement plan to this outreach and engagement strategy, we're going to talk first about the constraints. So you can see those listed on the slide here. Firstly, a constraint is our timeline. Our final products, as I mentioned, are due at the end of December of 2024. So we do have a fairly limited time frame on which to conduct this work. Our resources, although we do have Dewberry, our consulting firm from phase 1, is still on board to conduct some elements of this phase 2 plan. We are also currently in the process of hiring a new consultant to support with the remainder of the activities, including outreach and engagement. So the consultants will not be on board to support this until February of 2024. And so we need to establish this process for outreach and engagement prior to bringing them on board. Our process, importantly, as you saw on that timeline much earlier in the slides for the overall work of this subcommittee and the other subcommittees, we are developing portions of this plan at the same time. So typically in a planning process, you kind of collect the data, you look at risk, and then you work through the cycle kind of on a sequential basis. And in this case, we are going to be developing some of that at the same time. Value proposition, we are not making many decisions during this planning process that are related to project implementation or funding. We are not prioritizing projects with this plan, and we're not allocating funding. So the value proposition for participation in this effort is maybe lower than if we were doing those things. So we'll need to think carefully about how we message the importance of engaging in this when we are mostly focusing on doing an updated exposure assessment and risk assessment. And lastly, starting point, again, as I mentioned early on, this is an update to an existing plan. This is an update to phase 1. We do already have some data collected and stakeholders engaged. For example, this TAC is already established. As I mentioned before, some advisors can be added, and additional presenters and folks who provide guidance can be brought in to support the TAC. And opportunities do exist for additional analysis of some of the phase 1 input. So some of that input that we did collect via the surveys and other means can still be used for phase 2. So the second part of that process is to identify stakeholders. We have done some of this already at DCR. This is that IAP2 spectrum for public engagement that we saw earlier with inform, involve, consult, and collaborate, overlaid on top of a stakeholder interest and influence map that some of you may already be familiar with. The idea here is that we're identifying stakeholders and their level of interest and influence, and then mapping that against what type of public participation and the goals for public participation that we want to use. As I mentioned, we've started to work on this at DCR. We are hoping to spend some time today getting your feedback on this and filling any gaps that we may have in identified stakeholders, and also validating some of what we've already identified. To give this a little bit more structure, this is the question that we've been asking ourselves in identifying stakeholders. So who needs to be engaged to prioritize state support for regional needs in flood mitigation and action for flood resilience? Although we are not prioritizing projects in this plan, it's still a state level plan. And so it's important that we think about it in terms of the regional scale of the plan that it is. We've also listed these different kind of categories of what we are doing with this to help us make sure we're covering all of our bases in terms of what's going into this plan. So flood exposure, impacts of flooding, and resilience strategies. Who might be the right stakeholders that are going to be most interested and most relevant to helping us answer these questions? This is our initial draft of the stakeholder analysis. And again, we're going to talk about this further later on. You'll see that because this is a state plan, the state level and regional level entities appear higher ranked on the scale of impact. So that's the y-axis. And then generally, we're looking at the x-axis for vulnerability or interest in terms of vulnerability to flooding. And that can be you know, physical vulnerability as well as social vulnerability and a combination of the two. So we've got, for example, VDEM ranked very highly on the right, along with DCR. We've got at-risk localities in the bottom right quadrant. Got localities that are not at risk in the bottom left quadrant, et cetera. So all of the individuals that appear in this map, this analysis, no matter where you end up on the spectrum, you will be engaged through this process. So we're committed to providing opportunities for meaningful input for all of these entities, but we're prioritizing our limited resources for direct engagement according to the findings of what this looks like. So this slide shows our thinking about the why question. Why are we engaging with these folks? So you can see here, this in the center of the screen is a process diagram for planning a plan development, starting with collect data, moving through assess impacts, identify strategies, prioritize plan and align funding, and then implement. So in each of these, we've identified a question or questions that we would like to ask of these different groups to help us get feedback on and develop this plan. This slide is a lot, I recognize that, and I hope you all will take a look at it more closely after the meeting and provide any feedback to us. You can always send feedback to the chair and to DCR staff in writing via email. So this is putting it all together: who, why, how, and a little bit of the what in terms of the methods. So you can see on the left, we've got stakeholder agencies, in the center, the different methods, our goals, again, back to that IAP2 spectrum for public participation, and then the type of questions that we're asking or what we're seeking feedback on in the final column all the way on the right. I'm going to walk through each of these on the next slide. I will note that one adjustment we are already contemplating making is doing a survey of localities and other important stakeholders early in this process to get input from them about particularly how they've used phase one. We don't have a lot of good information right now about how localities have used the risk assessment and used the products that we created back in December of 2021. So we're thinking about, based on feedback from other subcommittees, whether some type of survey could help us with phase two. All right, so here is the putting it all together with the schedule. At the top in the yellow, collaborate on an ongoing basis. We will be having these quarterly meetings of the TAC and the subcommittees. As I mentioned previously, we're proposing to work with VDEM and their newly relaunched critical infrastructure working group. That's that COV-CIP working group. Hoping to work with them to identify the critical infrastructure data that we should be using, and also what types of flood hazard outputs would be most useful to them for analyzing their critical infrastructure vulnerability. Coastal PDCs and their respective localities. We are launching a Coastal Resilience Web Explorer user portal. We're expecting to launch that in September and are hoping to do outreach to make sure that is on folks' radars, make sure they understand how to use it and the benefits of using it. This is the way that we will be collecting input from localities and others to inform the analyze resilience activities, I think that's what we've called it, within the plan. So if you look back at those earlier slides on the contents of the plans, that will be feeding into that aspect of the work. Coastal Tribes of Virginia, we are hoping to, and again, this is a draft and we have not yet talked to the tribes about this. We haven't talked to many of these stakeholders about this plan, but we're hoping to host meetings with the coastal tribes to work with them to understand their needs, make sure that their priorities and the challenges that they're facing are incorporated into the plan. For high risk and low participation localities, we're hoping to do some analysis of who was engaged during phase one and identify those localities which are at high risk of flooding from both social and physical vulnerability standpoint, and those who have not participated as much in the planning process to date, and target working with those meetings, with those localities to host meetings with staff, potentially, if they're interested in hosting larger community meetings, our consultants may be able to support with that. But again, to make sure that those priorities of the locality, particularly the staff and any outreach they've already done to their community is reflected in this plan. Lastly, Virginia residents all have an interest and stake. Those within the coastal region have an interest and stake in this work. So we will be launching our website and are considering launching a new online survey tool, which could be available to use at any time. We're thinking about a participatory mapping element to have folks be able to drop a pin on a map and describe their challenges, their lived experiences with flooding, and to make that available so that others can access that data, be able to view that data across the coastal region. It might be a resource not only for the state, but also potentially for localities. So we would also host public info sessions to share information about this plan, what we're doing with the plan, and where we're at in the process, gathering feedback on, the point at which we're at in the process. And for all of these, we would need to do ongoing marketing to make sure folks are aware of what we're doing and aware of the meetings that are being hosted. I wanted to share this picture of current TAC members and invited members. The membership does look a little differently than the previous version if you go back and compare. The TAC was codified between phase 1 and phase 2, so membership has changed as a result. But something to consider, particularly as we're considering the question of, are there additional advisors or presenters or other folks that we would like to bring in for the TAC and the subcommittees to hear. Lastly, next steps. So our proposal is to take what you all tell us today, any feedback we hear from you about this proposed strategy, and work that into a written strategy for phase 2 outreach and engagement. That strategy would include greater detail on all of these planned activities that I shared on the schedule. We'll need to develop a public information marketing strategy. So how are we messaging this work? Approach to our online survey tool, if we end up creating something like that. What would it look like and how would it work? That gaps analysis I mentioned to identify target localities for Flood Awareness Week meetings. We'll need to think through further our engagement for the user portal, and then plan for documenting feedback collected across all of these activities to make sure it is integrated and reflected in the plan. So a few considerations for the subcommittee in your discussion. Are there any adjustments that are immediately obvious to you, having just seen a lot of information on this strategy? And do you have any thoughts on the addition of that kind of end user survey that we might consider doing relatively soon at the beginning of the process based on feedback we heard from other subcommittees?
Mary Carson, thank you, Mary Carson from Westland Watch. Hey, if it's helpful, we can share all of our hotspots and other data from our sea level rise phone apps. Thank you.
I sent that to you, Matt, but it's fine for everybody else.
No secrets here.
Yeah.
That was in response to like the Virginia residents survey tool. Your comment about, having a place on a map where somebody can drop a pin or whatever. We can include our data that has been, that's accumulated over a number of years, if that's helpful to the process.
Yeah, that's great. And I think, we want feedback on, given that this tool already exists from you all, how they might work together if we did create something like that. Do you see a role for that? Is it a useful thing for the state to create with this plan another kind of format for providing that input?
Great.
Any more points for discussion?
I mean, I guess I have a couple questions. I'm just thinking about what you said, Carolyn, about how the value proposition seems skewed because of this round two. And I guess I think this work can be framed in a way that there wouldn't be lower value in getting feedback, particularly if the second round of this is intended to address and fill some of those gaps that were left behind from the phase one effort. So, I think that a lot of community voices weren't heard during that first process. And so there's a way to revisit and ensure that people's voices are heard. But I do think that it will be important for us to really understand what the goals are of this outreach. If the goal is to hear from local governments, from residents about what their challenges are and compile the reflections of stakeholders, people and local governments, and catalog them and share that information in this phase two update, then that's one goal. If the goal is to help create that, these planning recommendations for the future, which is an objective for each of our work, our subcommittees of the TAC, as far as I can see, then that's another goal. And then if the goal is to get the feedback from stakeholders for the purpose of better aligning stakeholders together so that action can be taken that happens hopefully in concert with the state's greater effort or outside of the state's greater effort, like, for example, a community group, maybe it's a civic group working with a local government, or a NGO working with a local government, or soil water conservation district working with the local government to advance a project or advance a plan, then that's a completely different goal. So I think, it would be helpful to kind of talk through what's possible and what's expected in terms of goals, not really objectives, but goals specifically.
I went back to this slide because I think it's the closest thing that we have that speaks to what you're referencing at this point, Mary Carson, that these would be kind of the touch points and the point of collecting feedback and engaging that we've identified so far. And I think it speaks to, of the three things that you mentioned, the first two, it does not really set as an intention specifically encouraging collaboration outside of state planning efforts. It's very much focused on this plan, but I would be interested to hear from the subcommittee if those are the right goals and if we would want to consider what MC shared in terms of the last one for supporting maybe stakeholders to find each other and work together on this work.
Any more points for discussion?
My name is Colonel Brian Hallberg. I'm the district commander from the district. So what's the value of this information from my land, the federal government having resources, whether maybe it's a continuing authorities program or or something like that is, like, we don't know exactly who to engage with. And so this is a way to collect the data. So that's part of, I think, the value proposition that I would have is, like, we could come with some resources, especially for disadvantaged communities, and that would help with our engagement strategy. And maybe other entities that don't fall under disadvantaged communities where they need a cost share. And maybe that's a decision point for, you know, the state to say, good amount of community cost share with the federal government to advance a project in that area. We want to do good in a lot of communities, especially on the eastern shore, where the disadvantaged don't have a lot of money and they don't have a lot of time or capacity to engage with us because we're the federal government and have a lot of bureaucratic things to fill out. And so engaging with them, giving them this value proposition, and here is a way to get some assistance to fill out those documents. So there are some authorities out there that we have that we can share. That's when I look at prioritizing time and align funding, that's where I see we can, you say, can engage with, maybe we can do it one.
So if I could try and summarize it, basically, there would be an opportunity for USACE to use some of what comes out of this outreach and engagement and this planning effort to help identify communities that could use support but have not approached you for support yet, and work with the state to approach those communities based on the results of this.
I also think it would be helpful to see, maybe I'm just not following, but like where the first committee didn't touch, what areas, what populations the first committee didn't, what gaps there were in outreach there, because that's something I think that energy should be spent on. If there was a certain region that needed to be more focused on a certain type of population, a certain industry, just you can find out more about where the gaps were. Seeing if was there like a report that the first committee did, or
there was, so the appendices to the plan summarize the different strategies and include information like demographics, where people were, you know, where they live, what industry they're representing, their race, their age, that type of thing. You're not seeing it because we're proposing to do it but haven't done it yet. So that gaps analysis is something that we agree should happen but just have not yet completed it, and are proposing to bring it back to the subcommittee at the next meeting in Q4.
okay, because I think that will inform where we go next.
Yeah, agreed.
Okay, Brett Patsy, for the comment, it seems like our primary contribution is to lean into steps 4 and 5. Steps 1 and 3 are largely staff driven, and we can help inform and amplify the request for information with our various decisions. And then Mary Carson added, for number 3 on the slide, are we collecting the data and printing it in the phase 2 update and then directing or just looking at the future projects will be designed based on this data?
I'm processing this second comment.
You want me to repeat it?
Yeah, I think that's one potential application of that information. I think there's multiple ways that the assess impacts can be useful, including for just validating the impact assessment from phase 1. We won't be able to, like I mentioned before, a lot of the planning cycle is not happening in this way where it's, you know, very sequential and you're able to pause and get feedback from these different stakeholders. It's kind of all happening parts of it are happening at once. And so unfortunately, we're not going to be able to present the results of the impact assessment in full and go to the public and say, is this right? But what we can do is take what we hear from people through collecting those experiences and use that in future plans to say, okay, we got it right here, you know, we really didn't get it right here, and that's something important to know for understanding how to approach future plans.
Any more questions or points of discussion?
I have one. It's more of a point of clarification on my part. I saw on slide 33 that the plan is to collaborate and consult with tribal communities, which I'm really happy to see, but on the stakeholder map, they're not given like a location on the map. Is that because different tribes might experience different degrees of vulnerability with respect to coastal hazards? Or is it just?
That was an oversight. If they are not on there, they should be on there. We've discussed them extensively, and we will add them to that stakeholder map.
Will they be included as like a joint entity on the stakeholder map, or will they be kind of treated individually based on levels of vulnerability?
I think for the purposes of creating a slide deck with the stakeholder analysis, it's hard to put a lot of different, I kind of grouped people together just because it's hard to view everybody, but I think it does make sense to, we have received feedback from others and would welcome the subcommittee's feedback on this as well, that it would be advantageous to meet with the tribes separately.
Okay, and do you plan to meet with only federally recognized tribes in Virginia or state recognized as well?
We have not made a final decision on that point.
Thank you.
And would value feedback.
Any more points?
Okay. Sorry for the clicking. Okay. Our next point of discussion is subcommittee advisors. We are asking all of the subcommittees to consider whether there are any additional advisors that you would suggest. The process for this is that the Coastal Resilience TAC chair may appoint advisors, but subcommittees can suggest those through the subcommittee chair, who can then make that recommendation up to the TAC chair. Advisors may participate in subcommittee meeting discussions. They are non-voting members. Importantly, they are subject to the same FOIA requirements that other members of this body are. So it is worth considering that in terms of the restrictions on meetings and the requirements to host public meetings if more than 2 members of this body are discussing this body's role and the work of the body. So with that in mind, are there any suggestions for advisors, and are there any suggestions for individuals who might be good to bring in for a meeting to share their subject matter expertise on a particular topic, but not to remain on board as a member of this body as an advisor for the whole process?
Are we looking for certain technical qualifications for these advisors? Like, are we looking, or is it just from general pool of the population?
Yeah, we do not have any specifications for particular requirements. We're looking for folks who have expertise that is relevant to the objectives of this subcommittee, but that can look very differently for different subcommittees and for different people. Have somebody online?
Right, that's the added to that. It would be helpful to know what finance tools Virginia Resource Authority can offer to local government.
Great. The VRA actually is the subcommittee chair for our funding subcommittee, so I think they will be very well engaged in that discussion.
Got a thumbs up.
Great. And if if you want to think on this, you can send recommendations via email to chair and CCDCR for consideration if you don't have ideas at this time, but something does come to you later.
Got a thumbs up.
Great.
All right.
Okay. This final section of our agenda is focused on getting into stakeholder identification. So it's going to be a little bit more collaborative. I hope you're all okay with that this afternoon. Just quickly a reminder on kind of the demographics and the geographic area that we're talking about. This is our planning area shown on the right. I'll have another slide that's a little easier to see next. But you can see kind of that breakdown of different, what we used from phase 1 for demographics and social vulnerability. This was from the CDC's SVI from 2018, so it is a little bit out of date, I recognize that, but it's still, I think, a helpful reminder of who lives in the coastal region that we're talking about. And then on the next slide, so what we'd like your help with today is answering this question: who needs to be engaged for this prioritization of state support for regional needs for flood mitigation and actions for flood resilience? On the right, you can see the different planning district commissions that comprise the overall study area. And then we're not going to do this full exercise just because of the number of individuals that are participating remotely today. But instead, we'd like to have kind of a collaborative discussion around identifying the most important stakeholders that you feel exist within the coastal region that should be engaged, and perhaps focusing on folks who are maybe not already on the TAC, for example, to consider. So I am going to write things on the flip chart. Wheeler can type people into the chat as we bring them up. Folks online, please feel free to unmute yourself. But let's just have a less formal discussion around this question. And I put up there the considerations for flood exposure, impacts of flooding, resilience strategy, just to give you all some ideas for what types of things to consider when thinking about stakeholders in this space.
Other advisors to the VDOT on the transportation infrastructure and local government on stormwater, wastewater, water infrastructure at risk. VDOT, local government on stormwater, wastewater, and water treatment.
I'm gonna say DHCD, because I noticed they're not on the stakeholder map.
They are.
That was a very rough draft, initial draft that we put together. Just to give some context.
I just make an assumption by presence that we're stakeholders.
Yes, you are.
Okay, good.
What about utility providers?
Utility providers? Yeah. Certainly critical infrastructure. Board of Virginia?
Boards of Virginia.
Boards of Virginia.
Board.
Port. Oh. Port. Port of Virginia. Thank you, Brett. Sorry if you all on the line are hearing this paper floating around.
Maybe first responders.
And I think for some of these groups, we're thinking about, you know, if we're thinking about these highest levels of engagement with collaboration and consultation, are there, for some of these important stakeholders, groups or like organizing entities that can speak on behalf of first responders in the state, for example, you know, larger associations like chambers of commerce and that type of thing, rather than trying to reach all of the individuals with their different ideas.
Very bad, your DPA is already engaged with the stakeholder and noted accepting the mitigation to sea level rise possible more failure event. And then Mary Carson added insurance agents with parentheses, they're already on the spot.
I'll write them anyway, insurance agencies and Virginia Department of Health.
It looks like federal engagement is not as high or was as high on the phase one. Advisory committee, what about something with the National Weather Service or something like that?
So some of the like data providers at the federal level that are working on this, so maybe also like NOAA.
See, you don't have the Navy up there at all. No. And this, you have just a federal, the Navy should be involved. Unless you're looking at through the court, I don't know, with the interaction.
If it's through the lens of what the zoning projects, maybe, I don't track the Navy project. The same thing with the Air Force. Air Force has projects.
Navy too, Air Force as well, yeah.
Would they be important stakeholders to engage in this?
Well,
When thinking about prioritizing state support for regional needs.
I wouldn't prioritize it. It's the federal installation, whatever projects they're doing is going to push water out
Yeah.
to the surrounding, especially on the different problem on Norfolk and Virginia Beach. Because if we plan to get into construction of those projects, we can put water on to the level.
So federal installations are stakeholders,
Yeah. So this is Joe Howell. I represent Navy Region Mid-Atlantic and an advisor to this subcommittee.
Hi, Joe. Thank you. Thanks for being here.
Brett also added Navy national levy and national walls. And then there was Meredith that did Virginia Emergency Management Association. Goes hand in hand with DDEP, but it's a slightly different perspective.
Virginia.
Carson managed ample local governments, funding issues, include local government staff, leaders, NGOs, et cetera. Examples are the Chesapeake National Identification Advisory Committee, Washington County Floodplain Management Committee, Program Public Information Flood Risk.
So going through local government committees, perhaps, you know, as a way to understand challenges in those localities.
I would say working with the city of Norfolk and the city of Virginia Beach, they already know a lot of the critical inputs. We already have a list for both. The challenge on the peninsula as we move forward and we get a feasibility study for, we highlighted the Navy and the Air Force. The National Park Service is a gap, right? So they don't get a lot of funding for resiliency. I can't use Civil Wars funding to study them. So they're another stakeholder we need to engage and understand what their plan is. So they're part of the puzzle. The peninsula is a huge puzzle.
So National Park Service.
I would also suggest the Virginia Cooperative Extension for data.
What types of data would they be useful for?
They can do like, they can help with financial considerations, whether it's flood cleanup, help with recovery from disasters, things like that.
Okay, is that specific to agriculture or no?
I don't think so. I wouldn't. Let's see.
I
don't
truly
think
don't
so.
know, which is why I'm asking.
Yeah, no, I don't think so.
So DC, the cooperative extension.
Mm-hmm.
Doesn't help. Representing the Navy Region Commander, we would welcome possible opportunities to engage individual commanding officers representing individual installations and approach.
Okay, that's helpful.
For phase two, beyond coastal flooding, we're also looking at fluvial riverine flooding. get into more greater, the PDC, the upland areas? Are there organizations or communities that we're not aware of that exist in those upland areas that are experiencing flooding, not coastal flooding, but other types of flooding that we missed out on and needs to be considered? I think ag will be a big part of that, but there might be others as well that are missing. We've been so focused on the coastal side of the flood that now it's more inclusive as regards to flooding. The flood map will cover just about everywhere.
Just to stay on that point, is in the agriculture space, are there other organizations that might be good to engage with in this geographic area in particular?
In the coastal area, just the coastal area, or?
Yeah, the region that we're looking at for this plan, which is the,
Well,
those PDCs.
I would have to, let me look and think about that, and I'll get back to you, but there's a cooperative extension in all of those, in those
Okay.
areas, so definitely them. But you already have the soil and water districts on here.
Areas like Virginia United Land Trust, also known as VOLT.
Virginia United Land Trust.
Now, I have a question. The page two, we're looking at the coastal flooding. My assumption is we haven't run an inundation modeling to understand where are the areas, what areas with flood.
We have not, but we are right now.
And that would inform who to engage.
Yes, so we'll be able to map and know geographically what areas flood. Part of our challenge is who are the messengers to the different people, right? People are getting their information from different resources. How can we leverage existing networks and organizations to both share our information as well as to receive back what their challenges are? So yeah, there may be other kind of non-flood related, non-landowner organizations and stakeholders that are representatives of people in this APC geographic area. How do we catch
Is that because individual property owners would have the ability to get some kind of grant, an individual grant?
I'm not sure what individual grants are available right now. We're not proposing any through this planning effort.
But the reason why I ask that, from my lens, I don't do things for individual homeowners. I do things for a non-federal sponsor, utility or locality. I would identify where the risk is and engage with the locality and gain their interest. Now, support of that project is the greater outreach of the people, because there's always people against or for whatever that project is. That's why the outreach is.
I think that gets back to the question on like, why are we doing this engagement in the first place? And keeping in mind that, you know, what we're proposing to do is this flood hazard exposure, the impact assessment, and then compiling information from others on their projects and initiatives that they have underway. So considering those outputs, you know, who are the most important people that we need to reach, you know, to engage them for feedback versus who are the most important people we need to reach just to make them aware that this plan exists. And I think those are going to be different, and the general public, in particular individual homeowners and individual property owners, are generally going to fall under, you know, information sharing and consultation, as opposed to some of these larger organizations who have important projects or, you know, really need to, perhaps they want data to assess their risk. Those are the entities that are going to find the most use and have the most feedback on our products at this scale, at the kind of, it's a huge portion of the state that we're talking about, so.
So your agriculture, is that state only, or does that include federal? Because they have representatives and they're providing support to people all over the state, you know, as well at the federal level. And then HUD, same thing. You know, they provide support. But of course, through
So-
DHCD, we work with them closely as well. But
But USDA is who you're thinking of federally, or?
yeah, federal, yeah, absolutely.
I think specifically the Natural Resources Conservation Service, NRCS.
NRCS, okay. I'm gonna put HUD up here.
I think for these larger scale organizations, try to figure out where's the regional organization that's more in tune
Yeah.
to regional challenges.
I
Not
do-
necessarily go to DC.
Yeah. Well, no, I do know that HUD and the federal Department of Agriculture, they have people in office around the state now who work directly with individuals.
I'm also thinking maybe even though it's another federal installation, like the National Weather Service, especially those like more inland who do rivery flooding forecasting, just maybe from a data provision standpoint, and then like how they're communicating like discrete flood events to the general public.
Yeah, we have them over here.
Oh.
Yeah, no.
Oh, yeah,
We
I'm
wrote a
sorry.
lot of people. But yeah, and I think we also need to keep in mind the purpose of this plan, like, we're focusing this plan primarily on planning for the future. So the present conditions right here and now in terms of emergency response and that type of work is not really within the scope of this plan. There's definitely some overlap in stakeholders, but just to add that, you know, VDEM very much has that role and does the emergency response planning, and that's a little bit out of our scope. We're really thinking about the future of this region and how we need to adapt into the future to address the challenges, particularly of sea level rise and changes in flooding from changes in rainfall conditions and precipitation. So I don't think I covered that before. I just wanted to add that context.
Very important, and thinking about professional organizations and parentheses, I think there was an earlier reference to the Emergency Management Association. Looks like adding Virginia Floodplain Management Association and Virginia American Planning Association.
So this is what was the emergency?
Virginia, well, since the earlier reference to the Emergency Management Association, I think we got to be on the other one. It's Virginia Floodplain Management Association and Virginia American Planning Association.
Do we already have the Virginia Association of Counties too?
We have not listed them yet. ACO. We haven't mentioned, well, we talked about agriculture, but otherwise haven't really talked about like any other industry. I guess there was a port, but that's like quasi-public, right?
Can we go back to the map?
Yeah. I have it in my hand.
Say wineries would be exposed.
Wineries.
Very important. The service clubs are good entrance to many citizen groups, and the Rotary, Elks, Shriners, etc. Also recommend adding VML in addition to VACO.
How did she call them?
Service clubs?
Service clubs.
Elks, Rotary, Shriners.
One that we've also talked about internally is those, not clubs, but, you know, not-for-profit organizations that provide services, Red Cross as an example, United Way as another example.
Goodwill, Salvation Army.
More of the
Could you also bring in commercial fishermen?
Okay. Any other ideas? We haven't listed tribes, but tribes are, I think, important and are included already.
Yeah, I was thinking it in my head, but I didn't want to be a broken record. So
That's why you're here. Okay. I guess one question I have for you all, looking at the stakeholder map that's in draft form that we're going to build on, if I can find it. Do you have any questions or feedback on where some of these entities are placed on this map?
The ones that are already there.
Mhm. Or if you have ideas about where some of these should go that aren't there, open to that as well.
Well, some of them will automatically fit in some of the blocks you already have up there.
Because of association with another organization.
So for the next meeting, we'll have a revised slide that will include these.
Yes, I can certainly update this with the stakeholder map with the additional organizations that we've discussed, ones that were erroneously left off. We'll also talk about the gaps, the results of that kind of gaps analysis, looking at who wasn't necessarily as engaged with phase one. I think the most important thing here that I would note is the location of at-risk neighborhoods in particular. Because of the purpose and the scale of this plan, we're focusing really on connecting, you know, to the point that our representative from the Corps made. You know, we don't necessarily want to try to meet with every homeowners association or every community at that level. It's just not possible. So we're focusing our approach on working through PDCs and working through localities to try to reach areas that are current known gaps where there is known to be or expected to be higher risk and lower participation, and not trying to engage with every community at the sub-locality scale throughout this region.
Yeah, to your point, the at-risk localities, there's a varying scale there. That varying scale has to do with their reality and do they have the capability. They probably are highly vulnerable, but they have no interest, because they don't have the resources to engage at the federal or state level.
Yeah.
But then there are some localities that are at risk that have all kinds of resources that, you know, they are taking action and have influence. They're like in the top right in your quadrant.
Right, so yeah, not every at-risk locality appears the same location on this map, yeah. And in our project prioritization subcommittee, we had some discussion around for that, the survey that I mentioned on how phase 1 has been used and what kind of outputs of the flood hazard risk assessment for phase 2 would be most useful. That it would be helpful to hear from localities who are more advanced in their resilience planning, the Norfolks and the Virginia Beaches, as well as the localities that are not as advanced or have capacity challenges that perhaps the state could eventually help fill, or other actors could help fill. So reaching out to both of those different kind of wherever they fall in that spectrum.
Yeah, I feel like the problem, at least that I'm trying to solve, are figuring out the ones that are highly vulnerable, that don't have an interest, that don't have the resources, provide them in meetings that they
Move on the scale.
open their right.
Makes sense to me.
So where am I focused? I'm focused on the Eastern Shore.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, any more questions or points before we move on to the next section?
So the last thing I had was just some questions for you all. We haven't actually mapped the stakeholders, but now that we've had this conversation, revisiting that question about advisors, are there any additional advisors that you think should be recommended to join the TAC? Are there any other stakeholders jumping out to you that are really important that need to be built into the strategy that was presented? And then are there opportunities to coordinate with others, work through existing channels of engagement that you know, maybe some of these groups are already meeting and already discussing things with the state? Could we participate in one of those meetings rather than trying to create our own engagement strategy for reaching these groups? And if there is no feedback, again, I realize we covered a lot in the slides. So again, you can always send your feedback in writing via email as well.
Okay. With that, we will now enter the public comment section. Before we start with public comment, we just go over the procedures for public comment with the group.
Sure. Yes, before making public comment, please state your name. And each public comment is limited to no more than 5 minutes in duration. If we have more than 4 people that would like to speak, I think we have extra time today, but in general, if we have more than 4 people that would like to speak, the chair will divide up the time evenly amongst those that are interested in speaking. Do we have any folks signed up for public comment?
No one has indicated they would like to speak.
Okay. And we also do not have any members of the public here. So with that said, unless there are any other points on the floor, I'll call this meeting to adjournment.
Thank you.
We're adjourned.
Just for all of your awareness, we will be sending out a survey to try to identify good times for us to meet moving forward. So just be on the lookout for that in your emails.
It needs to be noted in the record.
But just make transcripts, so.